About half the US are expecting to quickly ban or severely limit abortions if the Supreme Court reverses its ruling Roe v. Wade. We are going to go over the nuance of this discussion and why these complex problems do not have a simple solution. Justin, what are the three frameworks that we really need to break down this discussion and answer it from?
Said another way, we're not trying to comment one way or not on the abortion issue. We're trying to provide a framework that will allow you to discuss and navigate emotionally sensitive topics. Consider this, Josh. 3 points to frame the abortion debate. Number one, you would have to answer the question, at what point in time does life start? Does it start at conception, or does it start at birth, or perhaps some other point in between or not listed above? The second question I think one has to answer is, to what extent can the state intrude on the individual, if the state can intrude on the individual at all? And the third question that I would say you need to resolve is when there is a divergence of interest between a fetus and the mother, and such a divergence or a divergence of interest cannot be easily reconciled, whose interests will trump over the others? But my suspicion is that if you start with the first one I mentioned, that when does life begin, you can then have a foundation to answer the second point. And the second point, when you can answer that, will give you an answer to the third point. Again, yes, not trying to say like one way or the other, but just trying to say like, this is a way, take the emotion out of it. And if you can reframe it like this, I think you'll have a very good foundation to engage in dialogue. And with dialogue, you'll be able to hear the other side, understand the other side, and hopefully vice versa.
And this is so important to take the emotion out of every topic. Let's break down the first one. When is a unborn fetus considered a human being? Is it at conception? Is it after the first trimester state, second, third trimester state? Is it once the baby is born? Because if you consider a fetus a human and you get an abortion, a human is then killed. Is a human being killed murder? Yes. So that is why you have to define when a fetus is a human.
And Josh, to build upon that, further complicating the problem is many people hold very deeply held religious beliefs that are the most authoritative beliefs you can possibly imagine on opposite sides. And so this is, I think, one of the interesting things that makes it so polarizing is that there's not an easy answer. So consider like the argument of like chocolate versus vanilla or whatever, right? For something that's like low priority, there's not really a right answer, but who cares? You do you or whatever, right? But in this particular situation, you know, it's one of those things where like, wait a minute, Justin, this is a little bit more important than what kind of flavor of ice cream do you want? Takeaway from this is that due to the sensitivity, and rightfully so, of this very important question, this is, I think, the first stumbling block. But what I would say is that if people can maybe work to say, okay, well, listen, this is what I think, or this is why I think it, if you can like narrow down and refocus the debate to this, it might help de-escalate the emotion just a little bit. And it might also help you to understand, okay, well, wait a minute, maybe there's another angle on this important issue I hadn't considered, or perhaps maybe, you know, there's another angle that someone else has considered that I need to consider that might help me evolve my own viewpoint. So
yeah, the first argument is, when is a fetus considered a living human creature? Because if you get an abortion and you consider a fetus a human being, therefore you are killing a human. But if you consider a fetus to be a human once it is born, therefore abortion is completely ethically fine because you're not killing a human. Justin.
So I would say that you've got two issues that you know, kind of like sub issues on that front. Number one, you have the issue of morality in the sense that I would assume pretty much almost everyone would define the intentional killing of another human being for, you know, 99% of the time to be wrong. Are there times when it's justified? Well, of course. But like for all intents and purposes, no. And one could probably go further and say the state has an obligation to infringe upon your right to kill another person. Again, within reason. Obviously, you have a right to self-defense, etc. But my point is that you kind of want the state to enforce. It's like stopping at a red traffic light. You know, yes, we have some limitation of our freedom, but society in itself, there's so much more that we get. It's a very easy investment. Very, very easy investment to make. So the two like sub things I was focused on, this is number one, you have the issue of moral. Like, is it or is it not moral to do this? So first component. Second component is it or is it not legal to do it? Because it's entirely possible you can have something that is legal but not moral, just like you can have something that is moral but not legal. So these two things, it's nuanced, but you know, it just kind of shows the delicate interplay and how complex and how hard it is, because this question or these two things are resolved by answering the question of when you think that life begins, and that doesn't really have an easy answer. Or the reason it's so hard.
If you ask 100 people, you will definitely get at least 20 to 50 different answers. Me and Justin have different views on when fetuses begin, and that is perfectly fine. We agree on even our disagreements, and we would say that we agree if we could just justify when a fetus begins. Then it comes into the state. What role does the state have in this? Justin.
Right. So if you go from just, this isn't necessarily my belief, so I'm just doing this as an example to illustrate how one might choose to think about and how one might choose to frame this. Consider the two extremes. If you say that life begins at the point of conception. So, when the sperm fertilizes the egg, then you say, okay, well, listen, we have two people that are in play right here. We have the mother, obviously, and then we have, the zygote, I believe is what it is, before the egg actually implants upon the uterus. But the point is that if the state has an obligation to defend and preserve and prevent murder against its citizens, well, technically, you have two citizens of the states, obviously the mom and, the fertilized egg. If you take the argument that, well, no, life actually begins at the moment of, birth, the baby's coming out of the birth canal or whatever, right? Or then from that perspective, you can say, okay, well, listen, the state obviously has a right to not intrude upon the mother. And because there's no other person in play, the state needs to be completely out of it. So this would be a very pro-choice, viewpoint of which to look at it. And so, again, I say this as extremes just to kind of illustrate the point, because Josh and I think you and I are both in agreement very strongly on this, is that you want the state in as little of your life as possible. You probably can't have it in none of your life, but as little as possible. But again, this gets back to that first question we asked, because I can't just have the state out of my life and up in your business, or vice versa. And the same problem arises, well, again, where do you consider life begins? So point number 3 is that, let's say then now. So the last question you have is that, suppose you have two people that are theoretically equal under the law. When you have a disalignment of interest in this regard, who should the law favor and prejudice over the other? So, for example, if one is pro-choice, they would say, well, listen, the law should always adamantly pro-choice. One would adamantly favor the rights of the mother over the rights of the fetus. Now, if one is adamantly pro-life, you could say that, well, the state should protect and enshrine the rights of the fetus over the rights of the mother. And again, this gets back to point number 1 of, why it's so important to define when life starts. But anyways, not to get sidetracked on that. Because there's not an easy answer on this, or the only easy answers we get, in my opinion, are the ones that are, the exceptions, but I say these are the exceptions that prove the rule. Josh, here's an easy one. Suppose there's some, birth defect where that, listen, the child is, there's some horrible thing, it's going to be mentally retarded, not able to function in society. At that point in time, it's probably a coup de grace, it is an act of kindness to terminate the pregnancy. If for no other reason, in the wild, without any of, society around us, the child would have died anyways. But again, I would say these are much more clear cut, because you can see through to a quality of life. But it doesn't necessarily reconcile, and I don't think it really gives any guidance to the larger picture of a matter of it's useful, I think, in some ways to cherry pick an extreme example, because again, it helps a little bit with the framing. But in terms of the broad public policy, I don't have any good answers for this. And the reason I don't think we have good answers is because it goes back to that first question, which is so hard to answer. And not only is it so hard to answer, but people hold their beliefs very, very strongly. And so you have a huge emotional component you've got to overcome to
and this is why you have to take the emotion out of everything. The harder the subject, the less emotion you need to derive from it. If it is forceful, no matter what it is, if it's the Ukraine deal, the COVID deal, the abortion deal, and any of these highly emotional subjects, you have to strip it down to the core values. And when you can get the core principle out of it, you can define a few core subjects that you can then debate. Because just saying, is this good or is this bad, is so broad, and you'll never agree with somebody unless you can agree about what you disagree with. And once you can do that, you can then at least understand both viewpoints. Because just say, I don't know how someone can feel that or that, Democrats, Republicans, I hate everybody. And then you can't come down to anything when you are just thinking at such a broad level. You sometimes have to take things down to nuance, or you should not be speaking on the subject if you don't have an educated view, because at that point you're speaking with emotion instead of with facts. It's so whatever way you lean, it doesn't really matter.
Well, Josh, let me carry that for a second, because the way you feel is completely authentic to you. You're perfectly fine to feel the way you want to feel. No one can deny that. But the point is, the way you feel will be different than the way someone else feels, and so on and so forth. Which means that one of the few universal truths to get everyone on the same page is you have to have something that's based on reason, not necessarily based on feeling. Sometimes, of course, you'll have an overlap. When that's the case, it's an easy thing to derive. But when you don't have an easy overlap, then it becomes much more complicated, particularly if you have to pick a winner and a loser. And if in doing so, you touch emotional subjects, very, very hard things.
And I'd say that is the main point of this video, would be first that complex questions do not have easy answers, and you cannot derive an easy, simple answer from a complex situation.
And be suspicious of people who try to do that.
And that's all we see in the media. We give these broad, easy answers to complex situations. You have to break down and debate these complex situations, or you'll never get to the bottom of it. So what is the right, should you have freedom of choice, or should there be abortion? That is a very broad question. I'd say a much more nuanced question is, when does human life start? And when human life starts, then it should probably be illegal to kill a human, because if you consider a fetus a child, therefore that would be murder. But if you don't consider a fetus a child or a human until they are born, then abortion seems much more ethical.
The lesson from this point, I would say, and hopefully, people are able to learn something from this, is that whenever you get into an emotional state, always be sure to check yourself. And if in doubt and you're trying to move forward, if you can at least agree on the key points you disagree with, that might be a very good first step, even though it's obviously not the final step.
Okay, we did not put any of our personal opinions in here, so if you have any hate mail, make sure to send it to Justin, as he loves it. Thank you guys, and hopefully we will see you in the next one.